This is an old hand plane. Picked it up from the antique store the other day to surface some wood. This one seemed in decent shape and it fit my hand the best. My goal is to get it working again, making sure everything functions as intended, cleaning it up and tightening things down. The big challenge is going to be sharpening this blade. It's got some pretty good nicks in it. Nothing about this process should be too hard, but I've never used one of these before and I'm not experienced with sharpening blades in general, and the precision for a hand plane like this, to my understanding, is pretty tight. If you're not familiar, the basic idea with a hand plane is you run it across a surface of wood, and the extremely sharp blade poking just out of the bottom flat surface takes off a paper-thin shaving of wood across your material. Should be good for smoothing out rough scrap wood that I work with all the time. Before diving into the precision of blade sharpening, I started cleaning up the parts of my disassembled plane. Using a wire brush probably isn't the recommended method here, but I'm just trying stuff. There's a lot of rust to pull off. My goal today isn't a full restoration, just getting it usable and a little bit nicer looking. As I scraped some rust off the blade, the brand name became more visible. Apparently, Fulton was the Sears tool brand before they changed it to Craftsman in 1935. That probably makes this plane at least 90 years old. I fully disassembled it except for the depth adjustment knob. It was still spinning pretty freely, so I didn't want to mess with it. I'm gonna repaint the main body of this thing. Just the interior that's already painted. None of the outside faces, obviously that'll touch the work material. I don't mind things looking grungy, but actual paint chipping off does bother me, so that's why I'm wire brushing it all down. I'm not sure if this is taboo within hand plane restoration, not sure if using brake cleaner is standard either, but if you've seen my channel before, you know I like to experiment and find out for myself why people do or don't do certain things. Those sides are getting sanded down after, by the way, don't worry. While I waited for that primer to dry, I got to work on sharpening my blade. I'm using a $3 Harbor Freight whetstone. I'm getting a feel for it by starting with flattening the back, then started working down my primary edge. I'm freehanding this whole thing to see if I can get it done without having any of the proper tools. Also, I don't think it matters much because I have a lot of material to knock down to get those little chips out of this thing. I very badly want to use a belt sander, an angle grinder or something right now. But I want to see if I can get it done with this little $3 Harbor Freight stone. There is a little burr developing. I can see that it's getting sharp, but those little nicks in it are just going to take a while to knock off. Now, I know I'm doing plenty of things wrong here. I've already watched hours of video at this point, and I'm aware that I'm cutting corners. But I think in the age of the internet and infinite information, learning by experimentation is kind of an underrated process. There's a difference between knowledge of how to do something and understanding of why we do it that way. So I'm approaching this like a kid playing with blocks, do something and see how it works. I eventually realized the Harbor Freight sanding block just wasn't that fine. It felt more coarse than this 800 grit. So I switched over to a piece of 1000 stuck to a wood block. Now I am literally a kid playing with blocks. By this point I was still kind of screwing around, but it was actually getting pretty sharp. So I'm figuring things out even if it isn't the right angle. The next thing I wanted to try is called a leather strop. Now I don't have one of those, but to my understanding it's basically a piece of leather that you put polishing compound on. I had no idea how much to use, but I just kind of guessed and went for it. Sure enough, it works. The edge got very shiny and very sharp too. After that round of experimentation, I went out to paint the body of the plane. I chose a dark green, same can that I used on my car actually. Looks pretty classy, I think. And to clean up the sides, which were rusty anyway, I just stuck it on a belt sander for a second. I think I could have knocked the chips out of the blade with the belt sander, but I wanted to see how well I could do it by hand with just the $3 sharpening stone, $5 polishing compound, and some sandpaper. With the base of this thing looking pretty spiffy, I started to reassemble for some testing. I still gotta refinish those wood handles and hone in the blade a bit more, but I wanted to see how much better it was already. Blade looked pretty good in there, so now it was time to try it out and see what I can learn. Adjusting the depth of the blade had a bit of a learning curve to it. but I started to figure it out and got some nice little shavings. Not totally there yet, but definitely better than it was. I'm gonna refinish the wood handles, so I pressed the hardware out of the front one. I just used a wrench and a socket extension to push it out. I thought about just leaving the wood as is, but it was scratched up pretty bad and flaking a bit. To sand down this knob pretty quickly, I stuck it on the end of a drill bit and put that in my drill. A little mini lathe, I guess. That ended up working really well, but this old finish was pretty thick. I ended up having to resort to higher grit, which did put some grooves in it with this method, but I just knocked that down with 120 after. The rear handle got the same treatment, although not with a nifty rotary jig. Danish oil is my go-to for tool handles. I feel like it just holds up better. It's always nice in projects where you have no idea what you're doing to come across some slice of familiarity. I don't know yet if this plane is going to function at 100%, but I know it'll look nice at least. The first test is taking some paint off this door. I kept moving the blade down, but it felt like I wasn't really doing anything. And at a certain point, it finally started cutting, but it was grabbing a lot. I know the depth adjustment is very, very fine, but it felt like there was no middle ground. Either I wasn't cutting or I was catching. My theory is that with sharpening freehand, I accidentally went for too steep of an angle on the secondary edge, so when mounted at 45 degrees, the blade was rubbing more than actually cutting. That's my theory at least, and so to test it, I stuck a penny underneath the blade before reassembling the plane. This slightly raises the angle of the whole blade and effectively decreases the angle that I over-sharpened this thing to. And what do you know, all of a sudden it started cutting much better. So I just resharpened the blade to a less dramatic angle. I also redid my camber on the blade, which is a curve towards the edges so the corners don't catch. Since I had the plane taken apart again anyway, I decided to add a clear finish to the wood handles. Figured I might as well let it dry while I was going through the sharpening process. And with that, it was time to reassemble this thing and try it out for real. A big reason I wanted to set up this hand plane was because a tree fell down on my neighbor's fence the other day. I offered to take all the wood for him, but it would take a long time to get it all processed with a palm sander, so I'm hoping the plane will be a nicer experience. The first plank actually went a lot better than I expected. Still getting the hang of it, but it's certainly a lot smoother than the other old planks. Now, I did absolutely no prep work on these aside from removing nails. I left all the dirt and algae on them, and for the most part the planer just glided over it like it didn't care. I should definitely be clamping these boards down so they're not moving around, and I'm still figuring out technique, speed, and pressure. But all things considered, I was making pretty quick work of these fence planks. Getting wood this heavily weathered down to looking brand new might take a bit, but I was shocked at just how fast it was to get these things smooth, at least usable for me. Look at just how terrible of shape this board is in, and with a handful of passes, it looks like that. And you know, it's just as easy to remove material with 40 grit on an orbital sander, but the final product here is so much smoother. And again, I'm not using proper technique, the boards aren't even clamped down, and the blade could be even sharper than it is. So as I continue to learn and get better with this tool, I'm sure it's going to replace the orbital sander for a lot of my needs. I've always seen people recommending these, and I never picked one up because I figured, well, if my orbital sander can do it, why buy another tool if I don't absolutely need it? But honestly, 90% of what my palm sander does is resurfacing scrap wood. So at the moment in my toolbox, the 90-year-old hand plane can mostly replace it. So I know this is kind of just a young, inexperienced guy realizing that a good tool is good, but I'd been avoiding picking one of these up. I thought I'd have to end up spending a ton of money on nice sharpening equipment and whatever, and it'd be a huge investment. But really, I paid $30 for the old planer, $3 sharpening stone, $5 sandpaper, $5 polishing compound. And there is a learning curve, but it's not as steep to getting it basically functional as I would have thought it was. I did plenty of stuff wrong, but there's a handful of boards sitting in my lawn pretty well flat right now. So let this just serve as a reminder to not avoid things that seem scary. Go try new stuff, be bad at things, you'll figure it out. And also, old is gold. If people have been using the same tool for thousands of years, there's probably a reason why. Thank you for your time, and I will see you tomorrow.